there any practical solution that you would give, like, because I keep asking myself exactly that. So I think about tipping, I still do it because I know I'm going to screw the person over if I don't tip them. But at the same time, I don't know, it's infuriating. So, yeah, maybe since you're,
maybe
I thought about this more than I have.
Maybe one or two more questions.
Sure, yeah.
So this is also for Jacqueline, so I really appreciated that presentation. So I'm sure you've heard of some of the, like almost like bans on tipping here in the Bay Area, right? I'd like to hear your sense of that, also because there's a connection to workers in the back of the house as well, so that the tipping is shared by everyone, right? And there's a lot of controversy about this, so I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that.
Sure.
It's the first time I've heard somebody actually address this.
Maybe one question for another presenter. Okay, in the second round maybe.
So as far as practical solutions, it is difficult, as you've said, because by tipping you perpetuate this sort of system and this relation which exists. But if you don't tip, basically you're just screwing over one person, you know. So I don't necessarily have a practical solution. I do, however, believe in, there's a One Fair Wage campaign put forth by the Restaurant Opportunity Center, United, in which, so the policy landscape in the United States is that there can be a tipped minimum wage versus the regular minimum wage. So at the moment, the federal tipped minimum wage is $2.13 an hour, as opposed to $7.25 an hour. So any practical policy changes towards keep making the minimum wage the same would be the first practical step that I can think of. And then to the second question, so each individual state does have the basically the last say in tip policy. So what you're referring to with sharing in the back of the house is what is called tip sharing. And if the back of the house and the front of the house both have regular minimum wages or regular salaries and they're on that kind of scheme, then tip sharing wouldn't be such a bad thing. However, most of the time when employers fight to have tip sharing, it is to take from the front of the house to subsidize the wages at the back of the house. So it's really important to sort of see into these arguments what's going on. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
How would you even know then if you're at an establishment that splits that way? Is there a kind of registry or a watch list or?
So a lot of times this tip policy landscape is a minefield. It depends on the state you're in, the county you're in, the city you're in sometimes. But what the Restaurant Opportunity Center does is they do try to give ratings of what kind of employers there are. There are employers who are taking part in this, but not on a wide scale in which we could, you know, it could be clear for consumers. So it is difficult to basically go out there and make an informed decision. Yeah.
I've got a little glimmer of hope for you.
Oh, cool.
I just read this morning that Assembly Bill 5 passed the state assembly, which would require Lyft and Uber, DoorDash, Postmates, and all them to classify their people as employees. So this would be huge for obvious reasons. It now has to clear the Senate and of course get signed, but it's a step in the right direction.
Step in the right direction. Great.
Yes, this is for Sam. Could you say a little bit, if you would, about the issue of reparations? And also, well, yes, just reparations in Africa, and you're moving back and forth, like you're between Africa and here. So in that context, maybe say a little bit to us about white supremacy.
So we live in a structurally violent context. And to be African in this world is to experience this violence as though it's something that's covering your skin as soon as you walk out of your home. And that's true for the African diaspora, whether we are on the continent or anywhere. So my research is looking at everybody across the African diaspora on the continent and then the 10 locations with the largest African population. And, you know, in the fight for deeper substantive climate justice, people are asking for a payment of the ecological debt. Now, what happens when you tell white people in power to pay their ecological debt?
Crickets.
They ask if you want a check or you want a check.
No, they don't ask if you want to check. So when you think about the, you know, brilliant, delicate, humble work that Randall Robinson did when he, you know, really talked about the debt, and then he also talked about this notion of self-reparations. And so a lot of the work I do, from the more of a, you know, anarchical, you know, orientation to organizing from the bottom up, is to ask us, and it even relates to Jackie's presentation on tipping, let's stop going to capitalist restaurants, right? I mean, we're making investments in that. Let's stop going to Uber and Lyft. I mean, let's start realizing that we can live our lives through cooperative, democratic, bottom-up associations, and we can make life convivial and beautiful through organic, free associations. So why don't we do that? It's because, you think about what Karl Marx said to Frederick Douglass when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Congratulations, you graduated from one form of slavery to the form the rest of us have. So as we think about white supremacy, you know, the vast majority of white people do not say that's their orientation. And yet we have this fascist moment on the planet, where not only here in the United States, but around the world, we have this rise of this, you know, kind of, you know, animus, this energy of, you know, we have to take our country back, you know, this narrative. And what does that mean? So when I hear we have to take our country back, we have to re-whiteify, you know, everything that's been destroyed by political correctness. So political correctness is this erosive thing that's getting in the way of what really defines the core ethos of what it means to be American, spelled with 3 Ks apparently. So when we think about the evolutionary process of human beings, my ask of people who carry white skin is to interrogate why you hold on to whiteness. And what would it look like for you to get on the journey of define whiteness with the way you live your life every day? In the same way that I have had to learn to now, when I do my pronouns, even though it says on my thing that I'm, you know, what does it say I am? I'm he, his, and him. I always say I'm he and they, because I'm sort of doing my own part to upset all binaries, because binaries are a form of our system of ecological apartheid. So, white supremacy is still here. I don't see a viable path to getting our world governments or the international financial intermediaries to pay an ecological debt. But what I do see, and this is, you know, along the lines of some of the scholars who are here presenting or have their books out on the table in the other room, is for us to break our relationship to systems of our own oppression and to de-link the way that Andre talked about in his presentation yesterday. In order to de-link from what's harming us, we have to link in to what fosters conviviality. And if we link in to what gives us conviviality, what we're doing is growing our ecological space with each other. It's not imperial space, but it's cooperative space. And the more we breathe life together into this cooperative space, the less space there is for things that are hurting us, and hurting the earth, and hurting world ecology as a whole. So I think we can hospice all of this shit, but the only way to hospice it is with a form of co-creativity that we lack the audacity, until today, to manifest.
Yesterday.
Do we have a question to Gutu? Do we have a question to Gutu, Vaisa? Yeah?
I missed part of it, and I wanted to sort of know the Oromo people within Ethiopia and that form of oppression, and how these leases are decided, because there's also a process of, in Ethiopia, it's sort of a contradictory process where the darker skinned people are also sort of oppressed and called tires and all of these type of derogatory terms. But I wanted to, if you locate it within the broader struggles of the Oromo people for recognition in Ethiopia, and how would you tie it into the leases and that type of resistance that you're talking about?
You need that, yes. We didn't need this one. And thank you for that question. A question which I may not be able to address fully in an exhaustive manner, but let me say this. Actually, Oromia has been before the early, until toward the end of the 20th century, was under self-governance. With the expansion of Abyssinians from the north, it was incorporated into the modern Ethiopia. And ever since, there have been multiple questions which came up in the form of two principal questions in relation to Oromo Ethiopian state struggle, which took the form of land question and ethnicity, the question of nationality. These two big questions have ever shaped the political engagement among different groups ever since. And that struggle also, because we are talking about land, the land question has been and is the principal question in state-people relations in Ethiopia in general, not only in Ethiopia, but in the bigger southern region of Ethiopia, which is actually, as I said, which was incorporated toward the end of the 20th century. I don't know if you are aware of this. Last couple of years, the resistance, intense resistance, which was started in the form of the Oromo protests in 2015, which finally led to a change within the ruling party, a new constellation of power within the coalition of the ruling party, which of course meant a new arrangement whereby the domination by the TPLF, a minority regime within the ruling party, has been sidelined recently. And the Oromos are actually taking significant share of power at the federal states as we speak, as opposed to 5 years ago or 6 years ago, or even 2-3 years ago. What I'm presenting here is, as we think of a possible new Ethiopia, new arrangement that actually is based on new grounds of justice and equality within the broader region, within the country, within diverse ethnicities of over 80 in Ethiopia. I'm using this data, which was actually collected 4 years ago, but as a way of thinking a possible future as we think about the cohesion among the diverse ethnic groups within the country. So things seem to be healing, but there are actually forces trying to move this transition towards better democratization, but also forces that would want to restore the status quo, which we had over the last 27 years, or even take us back as we try to figure out. A couple of forces, 3-4 forces are actually struggling, and that is the context within which we want to describe the uncertainties that we are facing, and of course hope in relation to what was the case before this current transition or reform has started. Thank you.
Okay, we ran out of time for formal questions.